to the Journey Mindfulness Podcast, where we dive into the depths of human experience. I'm James O'Neill, a clinical counselor, hypnotherapist, and mindfulness coach. And today we have the privilege of speaking with Andy Hilger, a seasoned executive with a storied career in the staffing and technology services industry. Andy's recent completion of a 25-year tenure, part of which as President of Allegis Group, speaks volumes about his leadership and expertise. His role in driving digital transformation and creating unparalleled customer experiences showcases his ability to navigate complex and ever-changing business landscapes. As a guest lecturer at Duke and American University, Andy shares his insights on a range of topics from leadership and AI to the future of work. His passion for innovation and entrepreneurship and creating opportunities for both team members and customers is a hallmark of his storied career. He's also a very good golfer and one of the good guys. So welcome, Andy.
Hey, thanks, Jim. It's great to be on. I don't know that a very good golfer would necessarily be attached to me, but thanks for the kind intro. I appreciate it. Looking forward to the discussion.
Well, you have a very interesting path, and it's funny. I don't really know a lot about. I didn't know a lot about Allegis and anything about you other than you were Jen's husband for a long time.
I think that's how most people still think of me and know me, and that's pretty good by me. That's okay. That's actually probably one of my two favorite titles. So there, Jane, Sophia, and Henry's dad.
Well, she's awesome, and you have a beautiful family. What else? And there was another time too. It really caught my attention, Andy, with you, and I'm sure you will remember this. But we were working out, and you were challenged to do a plank off. Oh, if you remember this,
I do. That was one of the Saturday community WOD days.
Yeah, and so you did the plank, and I remember it being over 3 minutes. But that was the first time, when you're learning about somebody, you catch something that in your awareness, and that's when I was like, man, Andy's mentally tough. He's a tough dude. Like that took a lot, and so I was just very impressed. And
yeah, I grew up with a couple brothers and a sister, and I think competition was always prevalent in the family, and I think I always really enjoyed competition. So my guess is if I tried to do a plank right now, I could do maybe half of what I did then. But the idea of, all right, I can't let the team down. I can't give in here. Definitely played into that. And yeah, I remember sweating and shaking and thinking, all right, I gotta gut it out.
Yeah. Well, it was very impressive. And that's one of the things that I do in my work, especially working with athletes and other professionals, but it's, doing hard things and doing like leaning into discomfort. And that was a big deal to see that and see you do that. Now you were an athlete growing up, but what was baseball?
I certainly tried. I played a lot of baseball, a lot of basketball. I hit ceilings in both those. I ended up a wrestler in high school. I ran cross country. I played a fair amount of soccer, but none to great effect. But I had some fun, and like I said, really loved to compete, and I loved being part of a team. So that always felt really good to me, and I think probably informed a lot of either choices or sort of dumb luck along my journey that I ended up really finding atmospheres that were very competitive, but not cutthroat individual competitive, much more about how does the team win and how does everyone feel a part of something bigger than themselves. So, yeah.
Mm. So you didn't end up becoming the shortstop of the Phillies. What happened?
Not yet. After these playoffs with Trey Turner swinging at pitches in the dirt consistently through the playoffs, I think I'm going to make a call into the Phillies and Dombrowski, but I'm pretty sure that's not going to happen. What happened probably with my baseball career is what happened with my basketball career and everything else, which was I had a lot of heart and a lot of desire, but in baseball, I was a uh, pretty good glove. I spent a ton of time as a kid throwing a tennis ball against our cement steps and watching the ball fly away. So I was really good at fielding, but I had a pretty weak bat. I was a contact hitter at best. The bunt sign came a lot when I got to the plate,
Mm.
and I think I started as a shortstop and then realized that the throw from the hole was probably not my strength, and so I got moved to second base, and eventually by I think 10th or 11th grade decided, hey, this is not it for me, and tried out for golf my senior year after a really rough wrestling season. I was pretty beat up and thought, I'm going to go have some fun, and managed to go get cut from the golf team before I finished high school.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, that was actually yeah, that was one of the more pivotal points in my life was getting cut from my golf team my freshman year. It's interesting how did you handle that?
Oh gosh, by then I had pretty good senioritis, and I think I was disappointed, but it was getting cut from 8th grade basketball was more of a scar, and I'll give you the quick story. I think I got cut from my 8th grade basketball team, which just put a chip on my shoulder and fed the fire that I was gonna go make my 9th grade basketball team. So I would go outside, shoot baskets, uh, make a deal with myself that, hey, until I made 10 straight free throws, I couldn't go in. So some days I'd be out there for a long time. Ten straight free throws doesn't come easy to at the time, probably 5'2", 98-pound person. And I became a really good shooter, but that didn't seem to compensate for the fact that I couldn't jump over the phone book, and was probably a defensive liability. And like I said, was maybe 5'2", if I was stretching it. And so I got cut from my 9th grade basketball team. And in the sort of era, I don't think anyone had named it then, but I think I probably had a lot of grit and thought, all right, fall down 8 times, get up 9. I'm gonna find a way here. And
Yeah.
remember taking biology my sophomore year of high school, and my biology teacher was also the wrestling coach, and he just said, "Hey, we could really use you out of the wrestling team. You look like you'd be a good wrestler." And I disabused him of that notion and told him what a good basketball player I was and why I was going to play JV basketball that year. And then another kid came to me and said, "Hey," and he was a junior. He said, "Hey, I think you'd be a really good wrestler. You should try out for wrestling." And now I've got these people seeing something in me, and so finally I decided, all right, maybe basketball's not my future. I'll try out for wrestling. They must see something pretty magical in me, and it took me about 4 minutes the first day of practice to realize that they had nobody who weighed 98 pounds to wrestle that slot, and so there were me and 2 other kids that had been told, "Gosh, you look like a great wrestler." So that was the end of my basketball career. But I learned a whole lot about life and grit and determination being a first year wrestler thrust onto the varsity team, basically because I fit the weight class.
Yeah.
And realized pretty quickly that sometimes my job wasn't to win. It was just to not get pinned and not give up 6 points, which was it. And you get humbled pretty quickly, but it also sort of fed my competitive fire. And by senior year, I was actually pretty decent, which was a big turnaround.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, you talked about grit and, Brad Stuhlberg coined the term, I think, rugged flexibility,
Yeah.
where it's like, going from one thing to the next in his book, Master of Change, which is interesting because it sort of ties into your career kind of with what the sort of, at least from what I took, you're kind of ascending at Allegis, but, being in the boardroom and having the chair removed and kind of stepping up and then wanting to quit and, dive into this role that was really uncomfortable. So that's really fascinating to me how, for those that don't know, maybe you could share that story. Is how that
Yeah,
happened.
sure. And yeah, and back to the grit. I think people sometimes mistake Angela Duckworth's work as you should never quit. I think she actually does say, hey, there's a point in time. You just shouldn't quit early and often. And if you commit to something, you got to see it through. And so I'm a big believer in her work and certainly Brad Stulberg's work. And I love that concept of rugged flexibility. And I don't know that going through it, I had any conception that that's what I was doing or had, and maybe didn't even, but kind of like the biology teacher, I had different people who challenged me and believed in me in ways that I probably didn't believe in myself. So I think the story you're referring to, um, I'll try to hit it pretty quickly, but I had come to Allegis in 1997. And I can talk a lot about purpose and some sort of grandiose language about that. But in the end, my purpose in 1997 was to figure out how to get a job and pay the rent and have enough left over that Jen and I could eat out once in a while and pay our bar bill. That was probably it. That's before kids. But I sort of found this company that was very team oriented, was super competitive, was growing like crazy, and uh, it was a lot of fun, but it was chaotic, and I didn't quite understand what they did or why they would hire me, but they were implementing a new enterprise resource planning systems. They were putting PeopleSoft in for those who are familiar with that space, and they realized that they needed to document their business processes and establish sort of the way they have done it, and then design a future process, and then engineer the technology to match the future process. So, long way of saying, I got hired as a business process modeler, which was the person who was really just capturing these processes in software, and I was largely behind the scenes, sort of seen, not heard, just making a bunch of notes, and when everyone left the room and there were three of us, I was one of the people who would say, hey, what if we took that step out, or what if we added a different role, or how do we think differently about this? But I was really somewhat intimidated by the sort of extroverted, sales oriented culture. It just seemed like all these super charismatic salespeople with a lot of opinions and a lot of confidence were leading this company to really great heights. And I sort of thought, hey, I know my role. I'm the guy behind the scenes, and maybe I'll see the world a little bit differently. And I'm good with that. I'm here just to buy some time while I figure out what's next. And it was probably about 2 years into my career when I was in a meeting coming up on Y2K. So if you remember Y2K, all those legacy systems everyone was fearful that they were going to crash,
A lot
and
of fear. Yeah.
planes are going to fall out of the sky. The electric grid's going to get crushed. Well, that was a really good thing for a staffing company, because we could find Unix developers and people who had lots of COBOL programmers and lots of people who could go in and fix that stuff. So that was good. The company was growing really fast, but it was also scary because, January 5th of 2000, we wanted to be able to print somebody's paycheck and make sure that they actually got paid. If I don't know how many people we had at the time, but if 50,000 people didn't get paid on a Friday, it was probably not going to be a good day in Maryland. And
Yeah.
so there was a meeting to sort out priorities. And I think the technologists were saying, hey, most of our resources have to make sure our systems are solid, and we deal with our own Y2K issues. But the company had split into four different business units, and each of those business units sent probably their most persuasive, loudest, most aggressive champion to say, hey, you need to do my stuff first. And part of the chaos was there wasn't a lot of process to decide, hey, which projects are most important? How do we do them? So I was in a room with probably 25 people that should have fit maybe 12 around a table. And so I was doing what I thought my job was. I was sort of back against the wall, making my notes and thinking, this process doesn't exist. It's terrible. There's a shouting match breaking out, and literally, near fist fights are breaking out over why somebody's business is more important than the other and why we need to do their project. And next thing you know, I see this flip chart marker fall on the floor in front of my chair, and I can't quite reach it without getting out of the chair. So I get up, but I reach down, and I'm just thinking, all right, I'm being conscientious. Somebody dropped this marker. Little did I know, as I got out of my chair, my boss at the time took my chair and threw it into the hallway. And so now, in the middle of this melee with people screaming at each other, I'm the one person standing with 24 people now looking at me, and my boss saying, "Hey, Andy, I think you have some ideas about how we can actually make some sense of all this. Could you help us land this plane?" And
So can I interrupt
yeah,
you?
stop me.
What was going through your mind in that moment?
Oh, absolute terror. I think I was super uncomfortable speaking in front of a room. If you've ever read Susan Cain's Quiet, where she talks about introverts, I was sort of your classic, I'll be the last to speak. I'll be the one who waits to kind of take the temperature. I'll make a bunch of notes. And when I speak, I'll be pretty nervous about it. And I just thought, this isn't who I am or what I'm doing. And I could just feel sweat forming on my forehead. I could feel myself turning different shades of red. But I also felt like I'm not going to confront the uncomfortable situation now. I just kind of have to gut it out because I don't know what else to do. There's all these people looking at me. I had no delusions that I was going to do a great job. It was more, all right, I guess I'll try to make some sense of this. And I barely did. I think I created a couple charts that said parking lot and action items and things that I had seen other people do. And probably at one point said, "Hey, you guys are actually fighting about something that you agree on. And here are a couple things we better figure out," and maybe fumbled through something at the end that was, let's reconvene in 2 weeks and actually make some decisions when we have some data to support it versus everyone's sort of rhetoric and emotion. But all that was super blurry and was anything but smooth. So
Yeah.
and then when the meeting was over, Jim, I felt that uncomfort had probably turned to, I don't know if anger is the right word, but certainly fear and maybe fear based anger, where I thought, you can't do that to me. Like, that wasn't fair. And so,
Yeah.
I was then pretty hell bent on telling my boss why I needed to quit,
Okay.
and why that was not cool. And I think I beat him to his office. I wasn't going to do it in front of everyone. And I just said, "Hey, Tony, that's not what I do. That was not fair." And he just laughed and thought it was the funniest thing. And I look back now and the stakes are pretty low. I'm just standing in front of a room that's not going nowhere. But to me, it was this seminal moment.
Yeah.
I was thrust out into the spotlight with no net and thought, this is crazy. And he just said, "Hey, give the meeting a grade." And I was like, "Well, it was an F, like it was a train wreck." And he said, "Well, it was that before you got up. How'd you feel like it went after you got up?" And I said, "I don't know, maybe a D. It wasn't much better." And he just said, "Yeah, D sounds better than F. I don't know. Seems like you made a positive impact."
Yeah.
And again, I'm like, "Hey, I'm glad you think this is funny, but I think I have to quit. Like, this isn't, I'm the guy who makes notes and tells all these charismatic, smart people, hey, there's a different way. And hopefully they figure out how to implement this stuff." And he got a little bit more serious and just said, "Look, this place is growing like crazy, and we're going to get crushed under the weight of our growth if we don't put some systems and processes in place. And you've been quietly evaluating this place for 2 years. You can do more. We need you to do more." And it felt less like an ask and more like an obligation at that point. And I think I said, "Yeah, but I don't know if that's me." And that's when he said, look, I know you can, and I know this company needs you to. If you don't, we're not going to get where we need to go. And suddenly, I felt 10 feet tall.
Yeah.
I had a sense of purpose, and I had somebody who believed in me. And I think in a lot of ways, I had a very meandering, wandering career path after that. But the thread you could pull through it was sort of anytime there was a unique or different problem that nobody was quite sure what to do with, they would say, hey, Andy, can you help us out here? And again, I had
Yeah.
no illusions that I had the answers, but I realized fairly quickly that no one did, and that collectively we were smarter than we were individually. And I did have um, maybe a learned ability to facilitate a meeting in a way that we could make some sense, figure out where there was some alignment and where we can move forward. And so I ended up doing crazy stuff. I flew to London and helped integrate an acquisition. I flew to Australia, for a couple of years and integrated a different acquisition. I ended up running strategy and
Yeah.
facilitating strategy sessions. I was the CIO for a while, so I got to do really interesting things that I probably had no business doing, but I
Well,
kind of leaning into it.
well, that's a big deal though, right? I mean, like to be put in a moment like that and to be confronted with fear, most people tend to run away from that. And I guess in that moment, you didn't really have a choice.
I didn't have a choice, and in the end, if I had been left by myself, I probably would have. I would have quit and just said, "All right, that's not for me." But I had been there long enough and had forged enough relationships, enough trust, and enough buy-in to the broader mission that when he challenged me and said, "Hey, we can't get where we are if people like you don't step up," I did feel this sense of duty, and I do think when you have a sense of purpose and you
Yeah.
feel like you're going to let people down, or you have a chance to help lift people up, you can endure a lot of discomfort and pain. And I think that was certainly true for me.
Yeah. Well, and you were fortunate enough, it sounds like, to have a boss that saw something in you and believed in you and your capability and, was willing to roll the dice. I don't say roll the dice on you. Maybe that's not the right term, but he, give you that opportunity knowing that he, thought you would rise to the occasion. That's pretty great.
Yeah, I was really lucky in that sense, and it was my boss, but it was also the culture. I think in a sort of fast growing entrepreneurial culture, the tone got set by the founders, and there was a pretty common saying that was, "Look, I want you to go try some things, make a bunch of mistakes. We can fix anything on the back end as long as they're not ethical mistakes." So there was a sense and a spirit of sort of, "Hey, we got this and we'll figure it out," that was just sort of pervasive in the culture. And when I talk to people who are thinking about what they want to do in their career, that's one of the themes. A lot of people get fixated on compensation or on title or on location,
This
and
is all the hedonic
brand.
treadmill.
Yeah, and in the end, like, all the research says that stuff doesn't bring you fulfillment, but if you can find a place where you can jump in the river and it's sort of pushing you to develop yourself, and it's just sort of in the atmosphere, and it's not because they have a, world-class, training program that you're going through. I mean, that's all well and good, but it's really just more about the spirit of the place. So that's what I was really lucky. I had a boss. I had a series of bosses that were that way, but I think partially because that's the way the culture worked.
But it sounds like it was a place that people cared about each other.
Oh, very much so. Very much so. And yeah, I mean, I think I would tell we didn't do a lot of lateral hiring at higher levels. We generally promoted from within, which sort of propagated this idea that we wanted people to take assignments that they maybe weren't ready for. But occasionally we'd bring somebody in from an outside position, and inevitably they would look and think, let me tell you what's wrong with all the stuff that we're doing. And I would try to welcome that and say, look, our processes are still not that mature. We probably do some things that are counter to the way a lot of businesses operate. And, I want you to speak up because we need to know where we can mature that. But I think we get the big stuff right. And the big stuff tends to be, we invest a lot in relationships. We care deeply about each other and each other's success. And when you do that, you can overcome maybe some immature processes or some less than well thought out approaches to certain aspects of the business. And I think over time the business matured, and we got a lot better at the things that were maybe challenges when I started. But I hope and I think what I learned in my journey was that my job more than anything was to be a steward of that culture and to make sure that somebody who joined in 2017 or ideally in 2027 sort of felt the same opportunities that I felt and not was never coddled, was sort of pushed to kind of lean into that discomfort and challenged in a really healthy way, but in a way that people cared about them.
Yeah. Well, and that was probably a big part of, what happened to you, right? Like you were challenged, but it was in a healthy way. Um, I am curious, Andy, what, your boss saw something in you and, you go from ready to quit to standing 10 feet tall. At what point, like, was it immediate that you like, I'm very big into, looking into our beliefs and how we see ourselves. Cause a lot of times we see ourselves in a distorted way, or we don't see our self-worth in our power. At what point did you buy in to what your boss was seeing in you?
I mean, that meeting was maybe a marker moment in sort of a pivot in my career where suddenly I thought, all right, I no longer define myself in a fairly narrow way as the nerdy introverted guy with the glasses who is going to make some notes. But I don't know that I think we all still are challenged with sort of that imposter syndrome. And I think I after that. I remember going to some meetings that I thought I have no business being here, but I was really good at taking notes and forming an agenda and doing things that nobody else really liked to do, and so I get pulled into rooms, um, but it was a series of sort of those moments over time where I realized. Hey, maybe I'm not bad at this. And it probably wasn't, I'm great at it, but I realized, sometimes you sort of, you find out what you're good at, where you going to find your purpose and where they'll pay you to do something. And that's sort of the Venn diagram, if you will. And I realized, that I was really pretty good at facilitating tough rooms through interesting, complex challenges, and that was a bit of a ticket to take on new and interesting challenges. So I don't know, Jim. It was probably then, 3 or 4 years after that when another guy who was president of one of the operating companies kept sort of leaning on me for stuff, and we became really close, and are still really close to this day. That I sort of felt, hey, maybe I do know more than I think I do, or I'm able to help out in a way that I wouldn't have thought. I remember, calling my parents and saying, hey, I just got promoted to run, I don't know, at this point, marketing and human resources, and I was the IT person for this business unit. And my mom sort of laughed, like, weren't you an English and philosophy major? And weren't you the guy who never wanted to go into business? Like, did they really listen to you? And yeah, it's funny, but they do. And so far I haven't screwed anything up too badly, but the day's young. We'll see. So it was just sort of a gradual kind of gaining of confidence through a number of those experiences. And I think, you talk about discomfort. I didn't have the term then, but I think what Allegis was really good at and probably just understood intuitively was this concept of anti-fragility, and this idea that, the opposite of kind of it. it's not about how do we protect people from making mistakes. It's how do we celebrate people who are taking risks and making some mistakes, and how do we learn that the anti-fragile are going to survive and thrive. And it's not about surviving adversity. It's about thriving through adversity and realizing that's where you're going to, accumulate your strengths. It's funny when you read my intro, it's all the intros and all the LinkedIn profiles and the resumes are all the good stuff. But the reality is, the real story of how somebody accomplished anything is usually a story of all their failures along the way that allow them to realize, hey, I've got to get better, or maybe I'm doing the wrong stuff, or whatever. And I think the world would be well served with sort of more of an understanding of anti-fragility and some of the, I don't know if you read the Nassim Taleb stuff or looked into that, but it's got kind of biology, and I'm a big believer in that. And I think, it's a lesson in parenting too. Like sometimes we can try to plow the road or helicopter our kids, and in the end, we got to let them fail, and that's a hard thing to do.
It is, but so one of the concepts in mindfulness, and when you start learning about meditation, is the hurricanes come, and they're always going to come, but at any time when the hurricane comes and you're able to drop in and sort of center yourself, you can get to the eye of the storm. And if you can do that and weather the storm, you'll be all right. And you have to have the confidence to know that you can do that. All I have to say is, kind of what you're talking about, these are the most interesting things to me, where it's like, okay, you're going to fail. Know that. When it happens, you're going to have to be able to pick yourself back up. You guys seem to have created a culture of sort of welcoming that, which I guess some of what I see just in sports and in life with younger people is this fear. And I think maybe it's perfectionism, right? Like the fear of failure. And so there's a unwillingness to take risks. And one of the things that struck me reading about you is that you had an attitude and a willingness to go into those situations, to dive into complex problems, and whatever happened. But more often than not, it sounds like you probably solved them. But not everyone has that attitude to put themselves in there because it's scary. There is a risk.
Well, and I think it goes back to, you referenced the hedonic treadmill a couple times. I think when people are motivated by climbing a ladder and certain achievement, they tend to be a little more risk averse or a little more calculated in what risks they're going to take on, because they're looking at it through the lens of, how will this look to the powers that be when the next promotion happens. And I think when you apply that filter, you start playing a little bit from a position of fear, and I probably had some unearned confidence along the way, but I think some of that came from I never really, that wasn't ever what motivated me. Like I had no designs to ever be the president of Allegis, or really just about any position that I took along the way. I would tell people I never really had a job. I just had an assignment, and I had a bunch of different assignments, and I was super motivated by curiosity. And I think that allowed me to be a little more courageous, because I was not worried about how will this reflect on my career journey, and will this sort of position me well. That just never was super important to me. And so, I took some risks, but to me, they were just cool problems to solve with people that I cared about, that seemed to be important to moving the business forward. And so my filter for risks had very little to do with personal accomplishment or achievement, and much more about, hey, is this something interesting? And I think, lo and behold, come 2016, when I was on my way to lunch with the founder, and he asked me, "Hey, would you take on this president role?" I thought, "Yeah, you're crazy. Why would you ask me to do this? I'm just kind of the guy who helps you fix stuff." And I had led a lot of people. I mean, I had done some interesting things, But the model there was much more of the people who had come up through the sales organization and were really, really talented, charismatic people leaders tended to be the ones who were asked to do these jobs. And so I hadn't even really thought about taking on this broader responsibility. Um, but as I reflected on why he asked me, and I think he validated this a little bit later, um, all those people were in the right job leading thousands of people. I mean, they were leading into their strengths, running business units or running regions or what have you. But I had this wild sort of breadth of experience that nobody else had. I had
Mhm.
done all these other things, and I think he saw potential disruption coming and saw that technology was going to play a more important role in the future. And this was before digital transformation had been sort of tagged by Gartner on the hype cycle. But there was a lot of talk of algorithmic business models and a lot of platforms that were coming out to um, get rid of our business and disintermediate us from customers. And so there were threats on the horizon. And he just said, "Hey, I feel like you've had more exposure to these things than almost anybody else. And I think you can help us see around some corners." And I think, the other thing that had done for me, Jim, was that uh, a lot of people stayed in their silo and had lived in the same business unit and had very similar experiences, but also knew the same people. And I had the good fortune to work with every one of our businesses across every one of our geographies, whether that was facilitating a strategy meeting or working in one of those businesses. And
Yeah.
I had a level of trust and a level of relationship. So yeah, I think that all, certainly played out in my favor, but it was never the plan.
Is this when you talk about the golden age of the generalist?
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
The world, suggests that we ought to specialize. That I'm a huge fan of a book called Range by David Epstein, that really makes this point better than I will right now. But everyone is pushed to specializing, and I'll be snarky for a minute. Like
Go
if
ahead.
you're an accountant, you do pretty well. But if you're an accountant who knows how to set up a structure that takes advantage of tax laws in the Netherlands and Ireland, you can do really well because you've got a really unique, special set of knowledge that can be leveraged to great effect for companies and whatnot. And we'll always need specialists. I'm not here to say that that's dead, but I do think now that we have a million specialists in our pocket, whether it's through the emerging GPT models, large language models, or even just access to Google and whatnot. I think that the people that are going to thrive for the next 50 years are going to be much more agile, and they're going to be really good at sense making. And sense making to me is people who can separate signal from noise, look across a lot of different disciplines, draw insights, and then come up with key questions and figure out how quickly can they prove or disprove the hypothesis that they have in moving forward. So,
Mhm.
it's a lot of what I think great entrepreneurs do. They may not be super specialized because they have to be a bit of everything as they're starting out, but they just see the market a little bit differently, and they
Yeah.
understand enough about political science and economics and behavioral economics and psychology, and suddenly they can kind of see something a little bit different than the world. And I think we're moving into a golden age of that. And I've got my sort of fears and hopes relative to this AI revolution. I think there could be a lot of good. I don't love a lot of what's happening today, but
Mm.
I think where it will be used to great effect is helping people become superhuman in a way by sort of leveraging those experts in their pocket in ways that right now you got to pay somebody a lot of money to do. So
Yeah. Well, Andy, I want to go back to something you said a little bit ago, and I think it comes into, there's a lot of, you're touching on a lot of things that relate to mindfulness. One, you were talking about how you sort of let your curiosity lead you. And, when you're doing that, you find there's a lot of interesting things that are happening that I think we often miss, uh, but that you can find interesting. And I think that it sort of goes into to sort of meaning and purpose in your work. And also, like, because of that, it almost seems like what led you to kind of ascending to the presidency was that, your ego wasn't like getting in the way. Like, we often talk about in mindfulness is like, I need to get out of my own way, like my own inner critic, or that kind of thing. And it sounds like that's maybe in part, or at least what happened there. But it's interesting to me how those things led you to where you're on your path and your journey.
Yeah, I think, I mean, we all have egos, and I'm sure, I've got a level of ego, but I'd like to think that if you asked people to describe me, humble and approachable would be early on in what they would say. And yeah, I do think you're right on the mindfulness front, sort of really dealing with that inner critic and finding ways to, be kind to yourself is super important. And I'll kind of, I've thought a lot about this. I actually wrote a piece on LinkedIn, maybe, I don't know, a year ago, where people used to ask me about, my childhood and my parents. And, I would say, well, I had a really pretty idyllic childhood in a lot of ways. So there wasn't a lot of trauma. We certainly had good days and bad days, and some quirkiness there. But I used to say, hey, the greatest thing my parents gave me was sort of a good set of values, a work ethic, and um, probably access to great education. I was really lucky, and I make no kind of bones about. I was born on third base. I didn't hit a triple. I not from a money perspective, just but from English speaking white heterosexual male born in 1969. You're already ahead of 99% of folks. And then I got access to great education, whatnot. Over time, Jim, I realized that was kind of it, but that wasn't really it. I saw this quote one day, and it stopped me in my tracks, and I ended up using it a bunch. But it was something like the way we talk to our kids becomes the voice inside their head, which it stopped me in my tracks because it caused me to think about the times where I wasn't super proud of the way I talked to my kids, first of all, and then thought, all right, but hopefully by and large, those were few and far between. But I realized what my parents did really well was they believed in me, and they weren't always super articulate about that. Like, we're not a family that names our emotions. I'll joke, my parents loved me so much they almost told me once, sort of thing. But I always felt this advocacy and this belief to the point where, in my 20s, I mean, I mentioned I was an English and philosophy major. I worked at a group home for a couple years. I went back to grad school, lived at home, got a master's in creative writing, moved to Syracuse for a couple years, took a job that I didn't really like or want to do. And I never felt this judgment or this sense of, you got to get your act together, which I think, as a 27, 28-year-old then without sort of a clear sense of direction, most parents probably would have been a lot less patient and understanding. And I think in a really strange way, like, that was their greatest gift to me was, years later, I actually, my self-talk is pretty positive. And as much
Mhm.
as I probably feel like I'm not ready for stuff, it's never sort of this sense. I feel a sense of worth. And I think, to your point around mindfulness, if I could wish something upon almost everyone, and certainly, Jen and I, our kids, it would be that they feel that same sense of belief in themselves and that advocacy, and that, the way that we've talked to them becomes the voice in their head in a really positive way.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I do too, Andy, is inner child regression work, but it's uncovering those experiences, from our parents primarily, just because they're the most, people that are around us the most, but just that influence us and that become the voice in our heads, and whether they articulate it or not, through other actions. But a lot of times they can become self-defeating core beliefs. And so some of the work is, we might call it shadow work, but just kind of cleaning up the code of those things. So like, our original programming, basically, we developed this operating system, and like anything else, your computer updates, your phone updates, like we have to update our own system sometimes. And if you don't, you can get into some sort of bad ways. Uh, but ultimately becoming more compassionate and kind to yourself and learning how to talk to yourself in a kind way will ultimately serve you, and at least identify the inner critic, if it's there, how it's manipulating you. 'Cause it's
Yeah,
in there.
and I'm not suggesting I don't have it. It's just I think I was probably I'll say this. Allegis was built on um, finding people who had a little bit of a chip on their shoulder, who felt like they had something to prove, probably had experience. This is generalization, some sense of trauma as a kid, and were hell bent on succeeding and showing somebody, hey, I am
Mhm.
worth. And that really wasn't my story, but I was really lucky because one of the things the company did pretty early on is exactly what you just described. Invested in some industrial psychologists and some psychologists who did a lot of that inner child work, and allowed people to really understand their marker moments as a kid, and come to terms with, feelings of abandonment, or why they have these limiting beliefs. And in some cases, I love the work that we did in growing the business and creating opportunity for people, financially and otherwise. But in some ways, that was the more important stuff, because that was the enabler of almost everything. Was watching, people who really hadn't done the work, or were successful, but weren't feeling very fulfilled because they hadn't dealt with some really unresolved issues. And I was a benefactor of sitting through countless sessions with people going through that, and probably um, it helped me. And I had sessions on my own where I would sort of have to mine through my own kind of childhood in ways that felt super uncomfortable, because
Sure.
it's being vulnerable is not a natural thing, unless you create a really safe, psychologically and otherwise, place for people. And so, yeah, I'm a big fan of the work, and I think companies um, owe it to their teams to invest in them in that way, which is not that's very counter to, you know shareholder driven. Hey, we got to hit a quarterly number, or PE backed. We're going to flip this thing in 3 years. So, everyone shut your mouth, strip out some cost, and we'll see what the multiple is and see how many people get rich. Like
Yeah.
that just I think is soul crushing, and unfortunately that's probably more the norm, and what I experience is a little more the exception. But I feel this sort of sense of obligation to promote a lot of the work that you and people like you do, because I think it's so critical for us.
It really is. Maybe it's hard to quantify on a balance sheet, but it's, you're unlocking people's potential, and ultimately, I would think, you know, increasing the team's success, as you put it earlier.
Yeah, and it's a good question. When times are tough, you start looking at all the expenses, and I think it would be natural to say, all right, how much are we spending on this type of work? But I think, again, I was lucky that one of the founder owner of the company used to say to me, "Hey, we're a staffing recruiting services company. We don't have to put a lot of capital into big physical plants. We're not building manufacturing facilities and laying out all this money." And he said, "I think our capital investment is in the culture and in the people." And so he looked at those sorts of things not as, hey, what's the what's the short-term ROI, but a little more like a capital investment, like, hey, this is the stuff we need to make sure this is a solid foundation and we're sustainable and viable for years to come. And the day we stop doing that, the day we stop, bringing people together for meetings and investing in both individual and teams in a way that feels super foreign to most people. It was the day we're like everybody else, and then we're just chasing a number, and then why are we here? So I think I was pretty fortunate in that sense, and I hope I helped sort of reinforce some of that in my time there.
Well, it just sounds like, again, going back to, and I know you've written about this, but just developing a strong sense of community and prioritizing that, or seeing the value in that, as far as helping people in their lives and feeling connected with one another.
Yeah, it's everything, right? I mean, in the end, I have lots of friends who work for places where they do a job, they trade time for money, they come home, and then they talk to their real friends, and we spend way too much time at work for that to be the norm. And I tell anyone, when I look back on my time, and I was talking to freshmen at West Virginia University last Thursday, which was a funny experience. When I look back on my time, like, the resume stuff doesn't matter. Like, none of that matters. David Brooks talks about the resume values versus the eulogy values, and the eulogy values are a little bit of how did you treat people and what relationships did you form, and are the people that you worked with going to talk about you the same way your family is, the same way your neighbors is? Is there some integrity to your values? And what you really cherish and treasure when you look back are those connections and those relationships. So if people aren't investing in that way, and sometimes it's easy to blame the company, but that starts with every individual saying, hey, I'm going to put myself out there. I'm going to be a little more vulnerable. I'm going to care about other success. I'm going to be maybe kind rather than nice. And to me, nice is, I don't want to offend you, I'm going to kind of walk away. Kind is, hey, I care about you enough that I'm going to actually tell you what I think we need to do to improve. And I know you're going to receive it in a caring spirit. And so, to me, that's the work. That's what makes it go.
Yeah. There is, well, there's so much. You have a lot of great ideas. In regards to retirement, one of the things that I did want to touch on, I don't know how you want to define the word retirement, but it's not retirement, it's renewal. Did I get that right?
Yeah, I don't know. I get super uncomfortable saying retirement, probably for a bunch of reasons, but mostly because I feel like why I left, why I stepped aside, wasn't because I wanted to retire in the sense of, all right, I want to go sit on a beach, or I want to go play golf. It was feeling like, hey, at the time when I first started talking to Jim about it, I was probably 52. And I thought, I've got another turn in me. I've got something else I want to do. But I was so invested in making sure we were moving forward in a reasonably good direction that I didn't have a lot of space to do that. And so I just kind of said, I need to step away and get lost a little bit in the forest here. And while I'm lost, I think I'll sample some things, which goes back to some of that range from David Epstein. You don't actually think, you don't think through the problem. You have to try some things and follow that curiosity. And then over time, figure out, hey, where am I getting a lot of sustenance? And so, I think we've created this notion that, and it starts when you're, in your first job and somebody's telling you about your 401k and, here's what you're going to have when you're 62 or 65 or whatever. And I think it creates this paradigm that the end goal is that. And the reality,
your number.
yeah, we're going to live to, I don't know, the people born today are going to live past 100. So what are they going to do for the last 40 or 50 years of their life? And that's what I look at and think, the last thing I want to do is sit on a beach. I want to kind of figure out what that next thing is. And so I love that concept of renewal. I had a chance, 5 or 6 years ago to hear Jim Collins, the guy who wrote Good to Great, talk about that. And it really just resonated with me. He started with the story of Led Zeppelin and said, you had really Robert Plant, Jimmy Page, and John Bonham, and they're this seminal rock band, and Bonham drinks himself to death. I think he dies, and it's this cliff moment for the band. And if you think this is still true, if you go on Wikipedia and look up Jimmy Page, it says lead guitarist for Led Zeppelin, 50 years later or something. And he's done some other things. But if you look at Robert Plant, he's started the Honey Drippers, and he does stuff with Alison Krauss, and he's just kind of kept reinventing himself. And I think the challenge I heard from Jim Collins was, hey, are you going to wait for the cliff to find you, or are you going to create your own cliff moment? And if you create your own cliff moment, are you going to be Jimmy Page or Robert Plant? All right. I think I got to create a cliff moment, and I think I want to be, more Robert Plant, and, I'll go explore. And interestingly enough, I kept using this metaphor of, I feel like I need to get lost. And it was right about when Arthur Brooks came out with a book called From Strength to Strength, which I recommend. I've recommended that book probably as much as anyone to people who are sort of in their kind of mid to late stage of their career, figuring out what's next. And he talks a lot about the type of intelligence you need in your 20s and 30s and 40s is different than your your 40s, 50s, and 60s. And he talks about the need to get lost. He references a passage in Dante's Inferno where you're lost in the forest figuring out life, and that can be a lot of fun. And that's been my experience. Like, I think there's so much joy in trying to experiment, and I'm in this super privileged position, and I'm grateful for it that I get to do it. But I don't know. I think everyone can kind of have their own version of that. And I just discourage anyone from, thinking, all right, if I can just gut it out for 9 more years, I get my pension, and that's when life can start. Like, life started.
Yeah.
Let's go. Right.
Yeah. Right. Like now. Andy, you recently became a Hollywood producer, right? You just put out a movie last month or so.
Oh, I don't know about that.
The Joy of 4 Feet.
With my dad. Yeah, I've been trying to write some longer things. I'll give you a little backstory. I've been trying to write some longer things. So I've recently signed on with a literary agent, and one of the things that he was saying to me, which I think makes sense, if you want to sell your book, they're actually less interested in the quality of the writing and more interested with your platform and your ability to sell the book. And so I would occasionally put these long posts on LinkedIn that were kind of not fit for purpose. And in the end, a lot of people would read them. I'm sure my kids were not alone, and just sort of saying, all right, give me the too long didn't read version here, TLDR. And he just said, you got to start putting some video out there. So I started to do these videos occasionally, and they were a little cringy. I was on the back deck, trying to keep them to a minute or whatnot. And I happened to be, as this is going on, I happened to be visiting my parents and driving them back from Western New York, where they spend a lot of the summer, to Philadelphia, where they are in the winter. And my dad had a lot of ankle issues, and he had been really challenged to play golf. But when I'm there, he wants to play golf. That's kind of what he wants to do. And so I just said, hey, let's go out there. And he's 86, so you never know how many more times you're going to get to do this.
Yeah.
So I just said, hey, I'm gonna start filming stuff as we went. It was gale force winds. It was a little bit crazy. And
It looked like the British Open out there.
it was something else. And I thought, and his balance isn't great. I kept thinking he's going to say no more. Like, I got to get out of here. He had tried to play it a couple weeks earlier. He played one hole. And so after a hole or two, I was like, all right, you want to keep going? As we turned into the wind, and this is going to be a challenge. And he said, yeah, let's keep going. So yeah, lo and behold, he finishes 9 holes, which was pretty amazing considering where he had been. And I had this footage, that I had just filmed him hitting the ball, and I think I probably interviewed him a little bit, but I didn't include any of that. And when I finished, I was like, hey, I'm going to create one of these little iMovie movie trailers and send it to him. And he was so excited about it that he just said, hey, can you send that to his high school class communications person, and to his sisters, and to the, golf pro where he had played that round of golf. And that's when it hit me. I was like, this would be a cool thing to throw there
Yeah.
on LinkedIn and demonstrate, the joy he felt. And I think he'll get a kick out of it. And sure enough, like he told more people about this thing. I'm still getting an occasional email where, hey, your dad, told me about this video. Can you send it? So it's a lot of quads. It was one of the few LinkedIn videos that I was like, all right, this one's actually pretty cool.
It was really cool, man. It just it highlights to me, you get it, right? Like it's part of life. Like those are the moments that matter the most, right? When they measure happiness, it's like things like that, and we all get back to, and maybe we'll kind of wrap on this, but you talked about the main thing. Maybe you could share a little bit about that.
Yeah, yeah. So I referenced these industrial psychologists, these psychologists that worked with us for a long time. The 2 main ones were a guy named Dr. Joe Currier, and a guy named Dr. Les Frankfurt. And Dr. Joe was sort of our key partner through all this, but his good friend and partner was Dr. Les Frankfurt, and he used to always ask. He was this really slight, meek sounding, but anything but meek Hungarian guy who would sit in these meetings. And I described a meeting earlier where there was a near fist fight breaking out, and he would just sort of calmly ask, what is the main thing that we're trying to get done here? And his backstory is horrific and amazing at the same time. He's kind of a Viktor Frankl type character. He had been in a Nazi concentration camp, had an identical twin brother, and probably the only reason that he survived the concentration camp when none of his family did was that Mengele was experimenting on him and his brother using these identical twins. So you think, man, that could turn your heart pretty dark. It was the opposite. He was the guy who just made you feel good every time you saw him. And you just, the respect I had for this guy was off the charts, to the point where, when he spoke, the whole room would stop. He was this, like I said, at the time I met him, he was probably in his 70s, and I knew him for a good 20 years. Maybe he was pushing 70, but he would just kind of in this quiet voice say, but I don't think you know what the main thing is. And we'd all fight about, our point being the right point. And he would kind of say, yes, but those sound like strategies and tactics. They're not the main thing. And so when I was finishing my time at Allegis, I had a chance to talk to the senior leaders one last time. And I wanted to talk to them. I thought, what, I'm going to channel Dr. Les. He had passed away in 2019. That's probably a story for another time. But I had gone to his funeral and really sort of understood that he didn't just talk about it, he lived it. He was all about the main thing, and everyone who spoke talked about the main thing. But there's so much wisdom there. How do I bring that wisdom to bear? And I was really wrestling, and a lot of the concepts we've talked about on this call sort of rose up as, hey, this is what I want to leave this team with. It's been such a big part of my life. It's going to be about curiosity. It's going to be about anti-fragility. It's going to be about all these things. And maybe a week or two before I had to go deliver this message that I was really anxious and nervous about. I felt this sense that, hey, this is the last time. These are people who've been near and dear to me. It hit me almost like a lightning bolt, and it was sort of remembering this call I had gotten the day that the announcement had gone out that I would be leaving, and it was this woman who I didn't even really know all that well. I knew her. I'd known her for 20 years, but I knew her husband a little better than I knew her. And she was just telling me how sad it was that I was leaving, and uh, I went into sales mode. I wanted her to know this was a good thing. It was great for me. It was great for the company. The guy taking over is awesome. There's a fresh set of eyes. Everything's going to be good. And she let me go for a little while, and then she paused me and said, "Hey, do you want to know why I'm sad?" And I said, "Yeah, you know what? I should have started there." And it was one of those like, "Hey, dumbass, like maybe you should," and rather than assuming you knew. And her voice started to break up, and probably even before she said anything, I knew what she was going to say. But she just said, "Hey, in my darkest moment," and that's when I the lightning bolt hit me. She and her husband had lost their 9-year-old son about 3 years before that.
Mm.
Tragic situation, accident, and I'll never forget going to the funeral. They lived just outside of Dallas, and it was as tough a funeral as I've ever been to. And I've been to a lot of funerals, but this is a 9-year-old. I mean, there's just nothing. It's hard to get your mind around how this could happen, and it was as sad a funeral as I'd ever been to, and just sobbing in this church. But there were a lot of us who had gone to visit her and her husband and to be there, and you never know what to say. It's awful, it's uncomfortable, but it's
Yeah.
important nonetheless. And pretty much that's what she said. She just said, "Hey, in our darkest moments, you and so many of the people that we worked with were there for us." And I'll never forget looking out in the church and seeing so many people that had been such a big part of our life, and you included. And I worry a little bit that this is a little bit of the end of that chapter for us and for the company. And what do you say? I think I assured her that the company culture was the company culture, and that I was there emblematic of, but that was going to live on. But I realized at that moment that there was nothing more important than the way you show up for one another and the way you connect. And I talked about it earlier. It is the depth of relationship, but it's beyond the good times. It's knowing that you're gonna call the person who didn't get the job, or you're gonna check in on the person who you knew had a surgery or was dealing with some particularly challenging situation. And in some ways, I think the sort of easy answer is you're there for them. But the reality is, when you look back, that's the stuff that gives you sustenance. And I tell people, there's a Korean minister who spent time interviewing octogenarians in her parish, and there's a hospice nurse who talked to patients. And in the end, the conclusions are always really, really clear. Everyone says, I wish I had better understood what mattered. And and sometimes that gets into the cliche of, I never wish I had spent more time at work. I don't buy that. I think it's less about where you are. But what I think they say is, I wish I had cared a lot less about achievement and a lot more about love. And I wish I had loved more. And that's usually my closing message. I find a way to weave it into most of the talks that I give, that
Mhm.
all the other stuff is good and hopefully helpful, and directionally helps people think through problems differently. But the main thing is the main thing, and the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing, and that is really about that love you give, and the forging those relationships. And I think I was fortunate to run into people like Dr. Les. And in this case, this woman who helped teach me more about the main thing. So I feel, a lot of obligation to help people put life in perspective. And those are the moments that put it in perspective for me, Jim.
Andy, that was very well said, and I appreciate you sharing that. Um, that is the main thing. Andy, what you're doing some interesting things. Where can people find your work?
Probably the easiest way is LinkedIn right now. I do have a website, but I'm not as good at updating that. But yeah, I'm trying to write a bunch of stuff and doing a little bit of teaching, and who knows what happens when I emerge from this forest. But hopefully, hopefully I'll be in a state of renewal. But yeah, I LinkedIn's the best place. So easy to
Okay.
find.
Very well. Well, Andy, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your wisdom. It was wonderful to have you here.
Hey, this was a lot of fun, and thank you for what you're doing. I know you're helping people through some challenging times and helping them find fulfillment and putting a lot of these things in perspective. So I hope in some way I could help amplify your message here, Jim.
Well, we're all on the journey, aren't we?
We are for sure. Hey, thanks, my friend.
All right. Thank you. Bye. Thank you so much for tuning in today and being with us. May you find joy, flow, and adventure on your journey. And if you got something from it, please like, share, and subscribe and or comment. It means a lot. Thank you.